Welcome back. Beef is farmed in many of the most sensitive and important ecosystems all over the globe, with the global population expected to exceed 9 billion by 2050 and income levels rising. The demand for beef is increasing and will only grow. Yet beef production requires land, water and energy and generates a considerable amount of waste. Is it really something that we need so badly? Those calories that we're willing to sacrifice so much? Well, there is a simple way for you to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, help preserve biodiversity and reduce water pollution all at the same time. Well, scientists suggest that it's simply by not eating beef. But for more on this, we're now joined by Nhlanhla Sibisi, a senior climate and energy campaigner for Greenpeace Africa, here in studio, as well as Dr. Botlhe Modisane, Chief Director of Animal Production and Health from the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries. He's joining us via our studios in Pretoria. A very good evening to you, Doctor. We also thank you very much for your time. I'm going to start with you, Nhlanhla. Take us through this research that scientists have now come forward saying that one of the biggest impacts that we can actually make to the global climate is actually to stop eating beef as well as dairy products.
Well, thank you for having us on the show. To start with, actually, research has shown that beef or the raising of cattle actually has one side effect, and one of the side effects is that there's a huge increase of methane, and that methane gas unfortunately is more potent than your CO2 that you find in the atmosphere. Despite the fact that CO2 is much higher than methane, the effect of methane has the negative impact of actually accelerating the global warming that we're experiencing. So yes, there are scientific researchers that actually have said that we should cut down on beef, and as Greenpeace Africa we actually believe that we should, too much of everything, that's the problem. So we should actually be cutting down on our consumption, but there's a whole a lot of other impacts that it has and measures that we need to take. And for example, the raising of cattle actually does require a sizable amount of land, and due to those combined factors, we do find that there's that high uptake of methane.
Doctor, I'm going to bring you in here. One would think, cutting out meat and dairy products is naturally going to affect our everyday lives in what we eat. Is this something that's actually sustainable for people to do, and also having a look at a nutrition aspect?
Yes. I think we should understand that livestock production is important for a number of issues, particularly from a point of view of nutrition and other products. But it goes without saying that agricultural production itself, not necessarily livestock, could lead to production of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and also methane. It is very true that livestock, particularly cattle, are known to produce a significant amount of methane, which really has got greater potential of trapping heat and then contributing to climate change. But we should also understand that particularly in Africa and in South Africa, livestock also contributes to a whole lot of livelihoods to the people. In some studies that we have conducted recently, we know that livestock production, second to salary, is one of the biggest contributors of livelihoods, particularly to rural people.
Now, naturally, when one thinks of greenhouse emissions into the climate, we're thinking of cars, we're thinking of buildings, we're thinking of more industrialized areas. In the context of this, what sort of part does South Africa hold in it?
Well, in our case, I could say that the responsibility, as rightfully outlined, that we do rely quite a lot on agriculture. And I wouldn't say that Greenpeace is saying that we should actually stop that activity now because people have to live. But at the end of the day, we need to look at sustainable ways in which we actually need to be doing farming. So the logical thing for us is to actually have the right policies in place. That's sort of actually not curb, but put a control over the way that we are doing farming. And the reality is that we are faced with this challenge and we ought to actually be doing something about it. And right now that the COP process is going on in Poland, these are the issues that they're actually tackling. And from a country perspective, as Greenpeace, we feel that we should actually be having a very much higher say in terms of how, for example, in this instance, how do we do or create policies that are actually give us an opportunity to have sustainable farming in the country. So we as a country, from a global perspective, we do have a responsibility to actually contribute towards that.
Doctor, do you agree with Nhlanhla's analysis on reforms and contribution that South Africa should be making in this regard?
Of course, yes. There are strategies in place and that we are trying to impart into our producers in as far as how to produce better without contributing so much to greenhouse gas production. Like for instance, we may argue that more intensive farming would probably contribute to increased production, but at the same time, there are other environmental effects that we need to consider if we are going to encourage a free-range production, because there are issues related to overgrazing, therefore also contributing to climate change. And then at the same time, we could encourage people to produce better, efficient feed to feed their animals, to reduce the amount of gases that their animals will be producing per se.
In terms of consumption, Nhlanhla, I'm sure people watching at home would think, what essentially does one eat? Women, sometimes in specific, we follow these fad diets. We eat according to our blood types, whether it's fish, whether it's red meat, whether it's poultry. So how essentially, would this actually be implemented in a way that is sustainable for someone who would want to participate in this? Is being vegan an option? Is it inexpensive? How exactly would you recommend going about this?
Well, to start with, we wouldn't prescribe exactly what you should be eating, but we should, acknowledge that our consumer habits actually feed into, they have a correlation, so to say, to the industrial farming that we are seeing today, as opposed to what used to be sustainable farming in the old days. So I would say that it's an appeal actually to individual consumers to look at their own habits. And I'm very much aware that in some areas in South Africa we use cattle for different reasons, traditional reasons, etc. And we're not saying that those habits they should stop. But at the end of the day, it does boil down to your own eating habits. It boils down to your own way of consuming, and ultimately it will assist that we don't have, because the higher the demand, unfortunately, the higher the demand, then the more farming that we'll see happening. So we as consumers, we also need to consider the fact that we are feeding into that, and we need to find a way in which I would rather say that to moderate, as opposed to eating the way that
Christmas lunches,
science is, unfortunately.
Easter lunches. Doctor, don't you just take us through the challenges that one would have in making this sustainable?
This is a vicious cycle. The reason why we want to reduce greenhouse gas production is for purposes of trying to mitigate the effect of climate change. However, we also understand that to a large extent climate change contributes to the demise of many of our livestock, causing a situation of food insecurity. You rightfully indicated that the world population is growing, and we will be looking at a potential of having around 9 billion people throughout the world. And I mean, we will need to produce enough food for these people. And as I rightfully indicated, it is not only livestock per se. We may be speaking now about cattle production, but all of lamb, pigs, and then also chicken do contribute their part in terms of greenhouse production. But if we have to look at the environment at large, all agricultural activity does contribute to the contamination of the environment, to a large extent also leading to production of gases that may also contribute, carbon dioxide for instance, and then other gases like sulfur dioxide, or even hydrogen sulfide. So I mean, it's a very sort of a critical and very dicey situation, because if we are going to reduce the production of beef, we may have to consume other things that also contribute to the environment, and then to a large extent also contribute to climate change. So, of course, there are strategies to manage and mitigate the impact of our production systems. So the best would be to apply those strategies as much as possible to try and reduce the production of greenhouse gases.
Well, chicken or beef, people might have to cut out both. We thank you very much for joining us this evening, both Dr. Botlhe Modisane, Chief Director of Animal Production and Health from the Department of Agriculture, Forestry and Fisheries, as well as Nhlanhla Sibisi, Senior Climate and Energy Campaigner for Greenpeace Africa, just talking about a survey that has been conducted by scientists suggesting that if we want to increase our contribution to the global climate and our impact that we're making, to cut out beef completely as well as dairy products. We're going to take a short break.